Mm, and really interesting stuff there. Yeah. Well, I'd certainly encourage everyone to go check out that website and read up a few more of those articles. I mean, again, in researching for this talk, I just found myself totally engrossed with it and going from article to article. Really, really fascinating. I do want to move on, though, Sarah, to another question here. Now, as far as your role, director level role for the MIT Norman V. Leventhal Center for Advanced Urbanism, for listeners who don't know, this center has become the world's preeminent cultural center for about design of metropolitan environments. So there's a lot of discussion and discourse surrounding ideas of architecture, urban planning, landscape architecture, and systems thinking. And also, when I researched, I did find that there's this distinct focus on examining how research and design can really help offset some of the challenges that we face in the future, as a result of probably some of this radical environmental change that is forecasted. And I'd be interested to hear a little bit more about that. I mean, in terms of the future, in terms of trying to offset many of the problems that we are probably, many cities around the world are going to be faced with as far as environmental change.
Yeah. Well, the Leventhal Center at the heart of it, we have 40 affiliated faculty, and at the heart of the thinking of this center is it's an interdisciplinary approach, which will help, produce those changes that we
Yeah.
want to see in cities. And the Leventhal Center has currently two major themes that we're focusing on. One is equitable resilience, which is really thinking about cities and climate change and how do we plan for the future of cities. Obviously, climate change is real, and many of the communities it will affect are on the margins. And how do we
Yeah.
make sure the planning that we do for climate change is equitable, as a huge focus of our research center. And we have people who do data analytics, but we also have a lot of people who are thinking about community impact, community engagement, and how do we make sure we get information from the stakeholders. But also we have designers who are thinking about really future thinking designs. If we plan with climate change as a kind of baseline, what do we what does the design of the city look like, and how do we both let's say mitigate and adapt, and adaptation is a big area of focus. Like, how are we going to adapt our current buildings, parks, municipal structures, everything. So that's a big focus. And
Would
then
you be able to even just kind of even provide a bit of an example? I know, like, for one, when I think, at least for me, like, the first thing that pops into my mind is like the rising sea levels, and like how many cities are quite vulnerable to that. I mean, how would that problem be, I don't know, examined perhaps within the context of this conversation?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So one project that I actually worked on too was retreat. So if the water levels are rising, how do we plan? How can cities or governments plan to actually buy out housing? And then where did those people who get bought out, where are they allocated new housing potentially
Mm,
in the town? So we worked with the Regional Plan Association in New York City to look at all of the coastal areas in and along Long Island, and there are actually numerous ones
yeah.
that are going to be affected by climate change. And New York State does have a buyout program. And what we did with these towns is actually think about, well, how can you make this buyout program effective by densifying maybe the town centers in and around the railroad station, bringing people in, but then actually allowing those old areas where the houses might be to be parks or kind
Mm,
of public assets that can be used by those people who move. But obviously a very controversial kind
yeah.
of look
Yeah.
at adaptation. But
Mm,
there's other examples where, you think about raising the housing. I do think that a bit of buyout is important, and I think we're all going to have to think about that.
mm. Was that
Yeah, and
bio?
yeah.
Sorry. I was
Go
just going to
ahead.
ask, was that buyout program that you just referenced, is that a program that's like generally been there to sort of like cover a number of issues, or is that a program that's been developed through, consultation, through, this attachment to these problems that we're facing environmentally speaking?
I mean, I think a lot of the buyout programs in New York and New Jersey, in any case, really came out of Sandy.
Okay.
I think the planning for them had existed previous, and they were considering them. And then after Sandy, they became like a more formalized policies.
I
I
see.
think one thing though that hasn't been done in a lot of these buyout programs is like, it's they don't get heavily promoted. There's not a lot of advertising, and then there's not a lot of strategy like in the towns themselves of like how they could make sure then those community members can stay in the town. So one of the things that we were doing is like helping communities like take this state developed program and think about how to make the impact to their community the best.
Okay.
But what was interesting is like we also did an analysis between New York and New Jersey between the way the buyout programs work. In New Jersey, they ask that several properties that are next to each other do it together, or else
Okay.
they won't get the
Mm,
buyout. And in New York, you can just have somebody buy out, but then the rest, they call it the missing tooth kind of problem. So maybe one or two people buy out, but then you still have the
mm,
problem of people, the infrastructure still existing in that area, because it's the expense of having like sewer systems, electricity
yeah.
systems going in
Right.
a community that's constantly being flooded. So like the buyout programs are also to help deal with like kind of keeping that infrastructure when it's not very
I see.
viable anymore.
Mm, okay. All right. Yeah. Well, thank you
But
for
we
sharing.
are also the center is also thinking about a new theme, which is called digital urbanism. And what we're really trying to do is rethink this idea. We hear smart cities all the time. I don't want to call it smart cities. I want to think about the ways that we can integrate technology into urbanism that's less like corporate and commercial and more works with the
Yeah.
equity of communities. And we're doing a dinner every Friday night. So we had one last Friday, which was science fiction urbanism. Like, what do
Mm,
we have to learn from science fiction and thinking
mm,
about urban planning and urban design? And then this week we're calling it Unsmarting the City. Really, what we want to do is come up with a new name for smart. I hate the word smart cities. It has kind of all
yeah.
kinds of connotations with it. So
Yeah.
could we come up with a better name for that? That's equity driven, impact
Right.
driven, talks about how technology can improve society, but isn't, let's say, techno solutionism. Like I hate techno solutionism. So I want to think
Yeah.
about the integration of technology. So we're talking about that. But we'll have, and then we have three other dinners which are coming up, which are fun in that area.
Okay. Exciting.
So
Exciting.
part of what the center does is try to start these conversations and debates that we hope will then get into the agenda of mainstream planning. So
Yeah.
that's yeah.
All right. Excellent. Okay. Well, let's shift on over to another question here. And it's something, equally impressive to everything that you have been doing. And I'd like to dive into your work with Envelope City. I mean, this is a business that you co-founded, and I understand that your business alongside Shop, one of the world's most innovative architectural firms, performed this Herculean-like task of modeling this wildly complex 4,300 page New York City zoning resolution into 3D. Now, before I researched this, like just that statement alone, like had me. It was quite fascinating unto itself. But maybe just for listeners as well, like what does all of that mean in terms of application? Like how is that being used, that model essentially?
Um, so what I mean, one of the biggest ways people use it is if you're a developer in New York City and you're thinking about buying a property, you want to see like what you can build as of right. New York's zoning is very prescriptive. Other towns and communities have like kind of looser zoning codes. So you have to go through like a process. You might be able to build a 10-story building or five, but in New York, it's very prescriptive, but it changes like block to block, street to street based on like how far you are away from something, how far away from a park, how far away from your historic districts. So it's quite complicated. And usually in New York City, before envelope, you'd have to hire like a land use lawyer to like help you figure out what you build out right.
Right.
So envelope is kind of what you can build, your building envelope can be, but the back of the envelope kind of calculation to see what you can mass out and what kind of square footage you can get. But once we put all of this data into a database, what you can actually use it for is also to search for properties, because now you know where underdeveloped properties are, because we know what you can build as of right, and then we know what is actually built. So I think probably people use it more for that property search than they do for the as of right zone. I don't know, maybe it's equal for that, but
And just visually as well, like from when I was researching, I found like just visually being able to see different things as well kind of gives you a different perspective or a different understanding. And I can see obviously where it fits in with everything that you've done, all the other involvement and all other projects. But it was really quite interesting to as I just said, visually see some of these properties or
yeah,
places
I mean, that's true,
themselves.
because the zoning code is this like text, like
Yeah.
written text. Like it's crazy because it's spatial,
Right.
and it's like all this written text, which then a land use attorney usually works with the architect to then like create the massing model
Yeah.
for these real estate developers. So our project does that. Not only does it like translate and tell you what you can build, but then builds it for you. And then you can change the parameters. You can say, well, I want 11-foot ceilings instead of 8, but it won't take any of my FAR off, so I might as well do that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
really, really interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Another question here for you. I did mention this in the bio, that your work, your design work, has been widely exhibited in the Guggenheim Museum of Modern Art, Venice Biennale, and Cooper Hewitt Museum. Now, for the listeners that aren't really sure of how art and design connect to data, perhaps you could fill people in a little bit on that.
Yeah, one of the things that I try to do is really communicate policy issues through data. And I try to do it in a way that captures people's attention and allows for a different dialogue or debate around a topic than would usually happen. So, art allows us to get outside of normal modes of thinking and to begin conversations. And so I think that's one of the reasons that using the design has been important for the way that I communicate my work. And I'll just give you an example, like the project that's in the Museum of Modern Art. This project, what we did is we took data from the criminal justice system of where people lived before they went to prison. And then we plotted those addresses on a map, and then we added up block by block how much money it costs to incarcerate people in those blocks.
Okay.
And then we found many blocks where it costs over $1 million to incarcerate people. And in those same blocks, we don't spend any money on education, job training programs, reentry programs. We spend no money on the systematic reasons that many of these people are going to prison in the first place. Instead, we spend it on incarceration. So that's what those maps were for. But we made those maps in this bright red color, black, very dramatic, serious. Then we had like a red line from every prisoner to which prison they went to, like on the map. And then, the use of the $1 million block, like the idea of a block, spending $1 million in a block is just kind of helps people conceptualize the total cost in a way. We all know we spend a lot of money on the criminal justice system, but if you get it down to like, oh, my block or that block is $1 million, kind of helps it create the
Mm,
dialogue of it. But it's also this idea that that map, then anybody can use it for anything they want. Like the idea that an image or design or art allows us to make our own arguments or find ourselves within those arguments. So those maps that they were made almost 15 years ago, I saw them all through defund the police. People were using them in their presentations, trying to explain that. And so I think for me, the power of design or using art in data is this ability to both communicate the insights of data, but then allow others to use it. It's hard for them to maybe make a chart or visual with data analysis, but they can take on images.
mm. And it kind of returns, to how we open things up. And you're speaking of like what you do is basically translating a lot of data and putting it into simpler terms where people can begin to like contemplate or reflect on it, think about it, which then of course can lead to action of some sort. And I guess the way you just described it there, through art, essentially, just the intrinsic nature of what you're doing when you are looking at art is you are deeply, oftentimes deeply thinking about it and what it means, and thinking, on so many different levels. And I can certainly see that connection there. One other quick follow up in regards to this, was this something that you had spearheaded? Like you'd introduced maybe this concept that maybe it might be worth exhibiting, or were you approached by some of these institutions?
So for that project, it started with us. We actually like proposed an exhibition at the Architecture League in
Mm,
New York City, and we had an exhibition not just of New York City, but like 10 different cities.
okay.
And then Paolo Antonelli from MoMA saw the maps in that Architecture League exhibit, and then she was putting together an exhibit called Design and the Elastic Mind, which was like, how does design change our frame of mind on
Okay.
certain issues in the world? And so she asked us to participate in that exhibition, like ask those maps. So
Right.
it's kind of both. We put out an exhibit
Yeah.
and then somebody saw our exhibit and then put it in the, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'd
a
imagine as
smaller to
well, like,
larger.
yeah, yeah, of course. I mean, imagine, once that ball gets rolling, essentially, you'd probably get approached by several different institutions that once they see the value of something like that and just how unique it is, really, and bringing all these different elements together. Yeah, again, really quite fascinating. Okay. Well, I do have one last question here within this Q&A discovery segment here. And to this point, we've been squarely focused on a lot of the professional side of things, but I would like to kind of segue into a bit of the personal side here. For all that you're involved with, I mean, what is it that professionally drives you to do a lot of this? I mean, you mentioned a little bit about your parents, for one, being journalists and that sort of that connection there to the civic side of things, but maybe you could take that further a little bit for us.
I mean, I definitely think at the heart of everything I do is I want to use my superpowers for good. Right? And so my superpowers are data analytics and
Yeah.
design. And I'm constantly driven about how I can take those skills that I have to improve society. It
Mm,
definitely comes from my interest in civics, from my parents and so forth. But I do think it's at the heart. I've always been concerned about people on the margins. Like how can we take, something like technology, which is like people are making money off of and corporations are making money off of us. How can we really like flip it on its head
yeah.
and use it to help people? And that's what I'm constantly trying to think about. Let's flip this technology over and use it to improve society rather to, I mean, making money is good. We all like making money, but like,
Of course, yeah. There's more to it, though, right? I mean, there is more
yeah,
to
there's
it
more
all.
to
There
it.
should be at least.
I mean, and that's one of the things that I've been really interested in lately is, if you think about all of this advertising data, like advertisers know everything about us, like
Yeah.
everything. Like you talked about something and now you're getting a pop-up of it. Like they really have a ton of information. And I've been talking with my friends, in the big data world of advertising, and I basically say, you guys, do you know what good you could do with this data?
Yeah.
Think about how, can we really flip
Leverage
this
this in different,
advertising
yeah.
data on its head and do something good with it? So that's my next big project. I really want to try to take some of this corporate data and access it ethically and responsibly.
Yeah.
We need to be responsible, but use it for good.
Yeah, yeah. Hashtag tech for good, right? I mean, yeah, totally, totally. I mean, even just like myself, I mean, going through, and you come across in social media all these different advancements, and every day it's something new, right? But yeah, what stands out for me, at least personally, at times, is finding these projects or finding these things that are going on that, like, again, comes back to technology being leveraged in a way that's going to positively impact society. And those are the ones, at least for me personally, now are starting to stand out that much more. I mean, the other ones are great for wow factors and everything else, but when you can see how the application of some of this technology can really affect lives in a positive manner, yeah, that's where the true excitement should be, I think. And at least it seems like people like yourself, are pushing that agenda forward, and hopefully getting it out to more people to become a little bit better informed, and to start to demand
We should all
some of these.
use our superpowers for
Yeah,
the
yeah.
betterment of society. Oh, that's the ideal world.
Right, 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 right. No, most definitely. Really quickly before we move on, maybe somebody what we both know of, Rosella Bottone. I think that was our mutual
Yes.
connection here. Yeah, you worked with her maybe on that central
She
migration project.
definitely works on her superpowers for
She
good.
sure does. She sure does. And when I had her on the show earlier in the year, I'd said during the recording, and even afterwards as well, the thing that just really stood out to me with her is, like, I just got this imagery of this big heart, like somebody who like genuinely cares, and that's what we need. And it's funny that we're having this type of conversation right now, because in a different kind of way, I'm kind of getting that same sort of vibe, that same sort of feeling. Like, obviously you're incredibly talented in what you do. And you could be probably, I'm sure, you're doing quite well
Make a
professionally
lot
speaking,
more money.
obviously.
I could be like in Facebook now. I'm
Right, right,
kidding.
exactly, exactly. But here you are, like, you're really creating a lot of positive change, and that's inspiring, I think, to a lot of people. And that's what we need. Obviously, that's what we need. We need more of this. So, yeah, I just want to throw that in there before we jump in this next segment. Yeah. Which, yeah, I think is a pretty exciting one. I'm really excited to hear some of this. Well, I guess a story here. We have a water cooler story segment, and yeah, for listeners, I'm sure they're quite interested to hear what you've got for us.
Right. So I was thinking about this, and I think a lot of what I do is a bit subversive, or I'm trying, as I said, to expose things that maybe people don't necessarily always want exposed. So I was thinking about a project, and this is an older project, but we went to Beijing for the Olympics, and I worked with the Associated Press. And at the time of the 2008 Beijing Olympics, there was no data on air quality, and the government wasn't reporting anything. So I teamed up with the Associated Press to make air quality sensors that would attach to their cell phones, and they could walk around with them during the Olympics.
Okay.
Through that, we did tons of stories. We were the only people, one of the things that we found was 26 times, the air quality, a particular matter was 26 times what you would see in New York or London at the same time. And so anyways, I got back from the Olympics, and my dean is like, the Chinese government is calling me. Like, what did you do in China, sir? And he's like, I was like,
You were
I
probably
made it.
you're probably coming back thinking, yeah, all right, I've done something pretty good here. This is pretty impressive, like, we can do something. And yeah, to be met with that.
He's like, all right. He was like, they want us to bring it down. And I told them no. I'm like, thank you. But I think I made it right out of right, because basically I left, and then I think I think it was like while I was in the air, they figured out who was doing all of this. And then
Wow.
I had made it back to New York by the thin of air. I mean, I'm sure taking a professor aside in China could have been bad, but
Right.
they were taking, many of the reporters that had the air quality sensors, they were taking them and putting them in cars and questioning them. And so at the end of that project, we actually only had one reporter who was working with the air quality sensors, because it was getting a little bit too dangerous.
Wow.
But yeah, anyways, it was, I mean, yeah, it was, I mean, I was actually pretty surprised by the Chinese government. They would just take in the Associated report, like grab them and put them in a car, have a
Yeah.
talking to, take their cameras. I mean, I thought these were stories from a long time ago. I didn't realize, I mean, 2008 is a while back now, but still, like at that point, the China was open up pretty
Hmm.
much to the economy. So it just goes to show how much they're still controlling the press, that we don't really even know about.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. That is
But I
quite
made it out.
that is quite, yeah, good for you. Yeah. We're all better
I
for it. But I
smuggled
mean,
the air quality sensors in on my suitcase and they came out.
yeah, I think
I
it's
don't
a
know if I
top,
should be
top.
talking about this on a podcast, actually.
I think you just nailed the promo right there. Right there is with that line. I think I've got it. Thanks, Sarah. I don't think I should be talking about this on a podcast. Yeah. All righty.
I
I
don't
think,
know if I should be talking about this. It's almost like it's 10 years ago. I think it's
yeah, it's
fine. It's
2008. Yeah, we're
like
good. We're
statute
good.
of limitations.
Well, I'll have you know, you've moved, firmly up into that spot, that number one spot for the water cooler story segment story, Hall of Fame. I think you've got it nailed down with that one. That was a pretty good one. Thank you for
I
sharing.
escaped the Chinese taking me to prison. How I escaped the Chinese government taking me to prison.
Alrighty. Well, we do have one last segment here that I'd like to get into, and it's called a crystal ball segment. And as the name implies, we're looking towards the future here. Usually, it's trends, predictions, so on and so forth. Now, with everything that you've done and you've accomplished, it would seem to me that technology has been a big part of it. Leveraging it, obviously, like your own skills and abilities, and experiences, and all those different things. But in thinking about technology, what do you see moving forward? Some different possibilities, for not only for yourself but the world at large when we're considering like the leveraging of architecture, design, and big data, and so on and so forth.
I mean, I think one huge thing that's going to be transformative is when we do have autonomous vehicles on the roadway. It's not just the autonomous vehicles, it's that they're capturing a complete image of the world as they're moving through the environment. And that is a whole digital world, like other three-dimensional space that I do think will begin to operate in. And it's going to be like the internet, I think, like in that, you have advertising in this world. And it's not like, I'm not talking about like a third space, or it's going to be in our world, but it allows us to do all kinds of augmented advertisements and project
Yeah.
onto screen. So like this, typical way that we think of augmented or like reality, like is going to really change dynamically by having these. And it already has, right? Like, I mean, one of the things that these kind of 3D worlds are used for is to help deaf people navigate the environment so they can, put headphones on and it's seeing, because if you think about it, right, like autonomous vehicles are the robots, or the algorithms are seeing for the car. The same thing can happen for humans as they walk through. So I think
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of applications that can come out of this for disabilities. I think there's going to be an explosion of technologies that are built on top of this 3D space. But I also do think like all of this big data, like I do hope that there's kind of a potential dystopic future, I guess, which I want to make people aware of is, Google advertising companies, they have more data than governments had. And this power imbalance between corporations and government and society is huge. And I mean, if I do a ton of work in Africa, and Google has way more information about the population, people, and that power creates a kind of colonialism that I'm not sure that we're completely aware of. They become, they become a de facto government,
Yeah.
because they have more information and control. I think of like Safaricom in Nairobi. They have all the cell phones, they have all of the data, they can make all the decisions, and they are making decisions that governments used to make. And so I think we really need to be considering that. I like to be positive, but like, I want to like really also think critically about, how do we change those parameters. It's not just about privacy. It's just about how to make sure we have a voice in our society, and to kind of equalize the power dynamic.
Most definitely. I mean, like those types of things that you're speaking of, I mean, they affect people socially, and that's changing lives essentially, right? Like governance and everything that encapsulates. Once you have companies that are in there that have a certain interest in mind, and usually it's that one track, it's like, yeah, obviously that profit, profit, profit. Yeah, it's going to twist and shape things in different ways that aren't necessarily are going to be in the best interests of the people themselves. So, yeah, I think it's fair to say that, we have to keep this in mind when we're, considering all that technology
We're going to have
offers.
another Cambridge Analytica sandwich. I mean, we haven't really done
Yeah.
anything. Cambridge Analytica happened.
Yeah.
It basically helped Trump get elected, and we still don't have any regulations around what to do. And we
It's
all wonder,
unbelievable.
like, how did Trump get elected? I'm like, he got elected through this data analytics process, and we don't have anywhere. We still haven't made any kind of headway into changing that. So that's something I'm very interested in,
Yeah.
is how do we inform government about the potential harms. But in this case, one of the big problems is government benefits from lack of regulation, right? So they
Yeah.
don't really make regulations around some of these things because they benefit, right? If
Yeah.
there's no regulation on cell phone data and then they can buy it and track us, then, why would they do that?
Mm. It's complicated real fast, doesn't it?
It gets complicated. So I really think there needs to be more groups in the middle that are advocating for our rights. And that's just a traditional thing that we've done in society. We need to build it up more around this data. How can we make sure, and it's not just like my personal data, but it's my rights and how some of these really big data sets that are powerful can be used,
Yeah.
and how to kind of limit some of the problems that they can have.
Yeah, yeah, most definitely. I mean, it seems as though, like, again, we spoke about this earlier, but you have these or we have these companies, technology companies, that are advancing at such a rate, and governments are just they're not there. They're not going at the same
Yeah.
pace. You need this other body, this other organization involved to kind of like keep up with technology in essence, and being like, keep checking on them, like, what are you doing? Is this the right thing? And then being that mediator perhaps for government, like, hey, look what they're doing, this might not be in your best interest. Because otherwise, right, I mean, technology and these companies are just racing way far ahead, and governments are just struggling to keep up and even just understand what's coming up right now, let alone 10, 15, 20 years down the line, which these companies, I'm sure, are mapping things out. Yeah,
Need data intermediaries.
we do. We do. And there you go. You found
That was going to be what I did on my sabbatical. And then COVID hit. Maybe I need to get back in there now that COVID's over. It's so hard to lobby anything during COVID.
yeah. Yeah. You throw that on top of all of this as well. Quite the challenge indeed. All righty. Well, I mean, it has been an absolute pleasure, Sarah. I've really,
Yes,
really enjoyed
me
this
too.
conversation. It's been riveting. I mean, we've covered a lot. Everything that you're doing, presently doing, and probably going to be doing down the tracks. It's exciting. It's exciting. And it's also quite inspiring. And I think listeners are really going to enjoy this conversation, including that story, which thank you for that promo once again.
A story I shouldn't be talking about on the podcast.
Oh, there we go. There we go. I got the second piece right there.
Next time you can call the water cooler story something you shouldn't talk about on the podcast.
There we go. There we go. Yeah, I like that. I like that. Okay. All right. Really quickly, let me close this out here. Now, for those
okay.
interested in learning more about Sarah and her work, you can find and connect with her via LinkedIn or through the many organizations and companies she's part of, namely the Civic Data Design Lab, Leventhal Center for Advanced Urbanism, Envelope City, and of course, you can check out her book, Data Action, through MIT Press. Also, today, if you like today's episode, please be sure to share. I mean, it's never going to be a bad thing. We learn a little bit more about one another. It kind of reduces that divide and that tribalism. So, yeah, please share. Also, to show further support, you can rate, review, and subscribe wherever you access your podcasts. And hey, head on over to YouTube. We do have a channel there under Life as a, where you can check out full video conversations, much like we had today with Sarah. And the neat thing is that you also can see some visuals as well. We have a slideshow at the start of each episode there. And then finally, don't forget to join us on the next episode of Life as a, where we'll continue to explore and unearth the details of professions and the people behind them. I'm your host, Christopher Schoenwald. Until next time, stay curious about life and living.